Desde la Universidad Militar Nueva Granada, en Bogotá, Colombia, transmite UMNG Radio. UMNG Radio. Una emisora alternativa, cultural e independiente. Desde la Universidad Militar Nueva Granada. Esta es UMNG Radio.
Tune in and speak up. Hello, English learners. Want to learn something interesting whilst having fun? Welcome to Tune In and Speak Up, the podcast where you'll get to know this beautiful language in depth. Each week, we'll dive into exciting topics, share practical tips, and tell you fascinating English language stories. So whether you're studying, going to work, or just relaxing, connect, listen, and let's make English part of your world. Wherever you are, whenever you want, just hit play, tune in and listen up. Tune in to UMNG Radio every Tuesday from 11 a.m. till noon. Don't just learn English, live it.
Nueva Granada Military University podcast, where we explore the fascinating history and evolution of the English language. My name is Jorge Bermudez. I'm a professor of English at DEIN, the Department of Intercultural Studies, which is part of the School of Humanities, Education and Humanities. So I'll be your guide through the stories, the words, the culture, all the elements that shaped English as the way it is now. Whether you're a second language learner or just curious about how English became the global language, you're in the right place. This podcast will help you boost your English skills while diving into fascinating stories from history, culture, and beyond. So grab your headphones, tune in, and let's speak up. This is our first formal podcast, and in this first episode, we're diving into the origins of English. Last week, we had a question. I asked Leonardo if he had any idea where English comes from, right? So if we ask our listeners, where does English come from? We may get different answers. Last week, we spoke a little bit about it. So why do we have words that look and sound so differently in English? It's really something interesting. And that's because the origins are from many different sources. So we have similarities with languages like German, like Spanish, like French. And many of the words that we use, for example, in Spanish have similarities, even though sometimes the meaning is not the same. In a future episode, we will talk about something that in English is called false cognates or false friends. And that means that words that look like a word we use in Spanish, but it really has a different meaning in English. The most common false friend is actually. Okay, so investigate that word. So why German, French, and Latin? We're going to answer these questions and take a trip back in time to the very roots of the language. Okay, so let's begin our trip about 1,500 years ago with a group of tribes called the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. So here we have a little picture of these people. These people came from Germany, Denmark, and they arrived in what is now Great Britain. In that time, the people living there were called the Celts. Celts were famous because they, especially for someone like King Arthur, for example. I'm sure you have heard of King Arthur. King Arthur happens to be a legend, right? A legend with some historical elements. So he probably did exist, right? Even though it's not like the stories we have today about the round table, etc. But he did live, and he lived, for example, also with someone very famous that we now know as Merlin. The original name of this famous Merlin was Merdin in the Celtic language. So these people were living there, and we can imagine these times. These Germanic tribes, these Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, came from what is now modern day Germany and Denmark. And in the 5th century, they sailed across the North Sea to the island of Britain. And then, when they arrived, obviously, they brought with them their language. That language is something that we call now Old English. And Old English is the beginning of a new language. So this English was the foundation of what we speak today. But if you heard it, probably you wouldn't understand anything. As if you heard Spanish from the Middle Ages, probably you would not understand anything. The sounds and everything were very different and different to recognize. Most of these words came from the Germanic roots, as we were saying. Here in the screen, you can see words like house, mother, water, and they. All these words come from Old English. But there is something interesting. Old English wasn't influenced by just one culture. It absorbed words at the same time from the Celtic people who were living there when they arrived. And a few hundred years later, the Vikings came from Scandinavia and added their own touch to the language. So as we can see in the screen, we have words like house. So, well, I don't know the original pronunciation, but I can see that is something very similar to the word we use today, right? House. Water. And as you can see, this vowel, the first we have a W, and then we have a vowel. It's a combination between an A and an E, right? This sound is very strange today. Is not used today, but in the past it was a very commonly used vowel. In fact, for example, the famous Elon Musk named his son, and he used one of these. He used this vowel in his name, and I'm not sure exactly the pronunciation, but it's like an E, right? So it's like an E between an E and an A. So I'm going to say just water, and then mother for mother. Obviously, we can see some similarities, right? It's a reminder of how much the language has changed, but at the same time, how some things have stayed the same in many ways. But how did Old English sound like? Here on YouTube, we found a sample of the Lord's Prayer. This version is approximately from the 10th century. This is what we call in Spanish El Padre Nuestro. Okay, so let's listen to this prayer.
Federure thu thearton helvunum. Si thin nama je halgod, tobe come thin riche, je urde thin willa on eordan swaswa on helvunum. Urne je dai huam likan slav, syleus todai, and furifusure gyltas, swaswa we furivathurum gyltendum. And ne je lad thus on kostnunge, aka lyshus of vivele, soth liche.
Okay, so interesting how you can well, obviously from the words in the screen, you know that it's the prayer, right? But anyway, it sounds like a prayer, and somehow you can know that this person is praying. But notice how different this sound was. You can find this on YouTube. Okay, so let's move forward a little bit to the year 1066, because in that year, the Norman conquest took place, and it was a turning point from the language. What happened? What is the Norman conquest? A king, William the Conqueror, from Normandy in France, invaded England and became its king. Here we have a picture of William the Conqueror. Normandy is a region in the northern part of France. And when they invaded England, they brought obviously French with them. This even changed not only the politics and culture of Britain, but obviously also its language. So imagine these invaders. Now everything changed. French became the language of the royal court, the government, and the elite. So we have seen in movies, right, like in courts and official places, French was spoken. And in fact, until recently, French, for example, was the language of diplomatic environments, right? Diplomacy was conducted in French, as well as many legal aspects for lawyers. For example, learning French was very important until very recently. And that's because this Norman conquest. So the common people in the streets continue to speak Old English. But the time passed by, and these two languages became one, or they started to blend together, creating what we call now Middle English. So imagine this situation. You have people speaking English on the streets, but French in the castles and courts. So this obviously led to a borrowing of words between the languages. Many words related to law, as we mentioned before, government, art, and food came from French. Here in the screen, we can see a few examples. I don't know a word of French, so my pronunciation in French may be totally incorrect, but I'll try. So government in English came from the French gouverneur, something like that. Justice from the French justice. Beef from the French bœuf. Courage from the French courage. I think it's very similar. Okay. So all these words came from the French that was used in court and in legal uh, environments, right? The impact of these Normans was huge. Today, around 30% of English words come from French. So we can imagine all the things. I was looking for a list of words, and wow, it's really, really long. A lot of words come from French. Obviously, in Spanish, we have the same situation because we have the common Latin origin. Okay. So next time you say courage, justice, or beef, remember that you're speaking a little bit of French too. And then, now that we mentioned Latin, Latin came with the church, so the role of Latin and the church. Another key influence on the English language was Latin. After the Norman conquest, Latin remained the language of the church, education, and scholarly works. Remember that until recently, until some years ago, even the Mass, when you go to church to pray and you stay for the service, you hear something that we call Mass on Sundays, right? This Mass was in Latin until very recently. Priests, monks, and scholars wrote in Latin, and many Latin words made their way into English. This is why many of our more formal words, especially in science and academia, come from Latin. We will have one episode in which we're going to talk about how English became the almost the official language in science and the academy, right? What we call the universities, right? Okay, so here we have an image of Latin from the Bible. For example, in from Latin, I mean we have words like animal from the Latin animalis, manual from Latin manus, meaning hand, library from Latin librarium. Latin gave English a lot of the more intellectual or technical vocabulary we use today. So if you're studying biology, law, or philosophy, you're likely using words that originally came from Latin. Okay, moving on to our next section, Shakespeare and the birth of modern English. As I mentioned last week, we're going to have one full episode dedicated to Shakespeare because that was a great influence. He made a great influence in the language. So we're now in the late 1500s. Okay, about 100 years later, after the discovery of America. So we're in the late 1500s during the time of William Shakespeare. By this time, the English language had gone through significant changes and it was moving towards what we now call modern English. Remember that the historical period that we know as modernity started more or less at the same time of the discovery of America. So that's why modernity is related to modern English. Shakespeare, who is often called the greatest writer in the English language, helped shape English in ways we still see today. Shakespeare invented hundreds of new words and phrases that are still in use. So in the screen, we have the website called shakespeare.org.uk. And in this website, we can find approximately 1,700 words that were created by Shakespeare um, for his plays and well, basically what he wrote was plays for the theater, right? So words like eyeball, fashionable, lonely, hurry, kissing, right, come were made by Shakespeare. Here we can see we're looking at the Spanish version. Somewhere there is an, an English version there, but look at how interesting we can, all these words that we use also in Spanish today came from these for the works of Shakespeare. In our episode, okay, there we go. We have the English version. So look, alligator, bedroom, downstairs, eyeball, fashionable, gossip, hurry. All these words were invented. Inaudible, right? Kissing, very popular today. Okay. So imagine the influence, right? The strong influence of this writer in the creation of the language. He also gave us phrases in some place in this website. We also have expressions that he created, like for example, break the ice, heart of gold, wild goose chase. So we will have the chance to speak about his influence. It's a very interesting website that We invite our listeners and our viewers to search. Okay, through his plays and poetry, Shakespeare expanded the English language, making it more expressive and versatile. Okay, and then the expansion of English took place, colonization and global influence. In the 1600s and 1700s, the British Empire, we have here we can see a world map with the British Empire, some of the countries that were under the rule of the British Empire. So this empire began to grow. British explorers, traders, and colonists traveled across the globe, bringing their language with them. So English spread to North America. Here we can see in the map, we have Canada and obviously the United States in the original 13 colonies that founded the country. Also, the two countries in the Caribbean, India, many countries in Africa, and Australia, mixing with local languages and evolving into different dialects. This global spread of English, combined with the rise of the United States as a world power in the 20th century, helped make English the global language it is today. So, if we do a search on internet, we will discover that the total speakers of the language of English, the English language, is about 1.5 billion people. If we think about countries like China, with about 1.7 billion inhabitants, we can conclude, obviously, that Chinese is the language spoken by the majority of humans. If we think about India, for example, with 1.6 billion people, things like that, we can obviously conclude that billions and billions of people speak other languages. So the English speakers are about 1.5 billion, but only about 400 million of these speakers are native speakers of the language. So they have English as their first and probably their only language. Only 400 billion people. But anyway, English is so strong and influential that the other 1.1 billion people use English every day as a second language. So about 73% of speakers of English are not native. And that's why we can talk about English not only as in the past, when, for example, when I started studying English, the what was considered correct was the British English, for example, right? So everything was about the British pronunciation and the way British English was written and spoken, as I said. But then gradually it has changed, and English from other parts of the world have been accepted as correct. For example, English from the Caribbean, English from India, English from many different parts. So we can talk about different Englishes, not only the British or the American English as being correct. So what makes English so unique? One reason is its incredible flexibility. As we mentioned before, it has borrowed words from over 350 languages. English is like a sponge, absorbing words and phrases from cultures all over the world. Whether it's sushi from Japanese, yoga from Sanskrit, or cafe from French, English has a way of making everything its own. Last week I mentioned, here we have sushi, yoga, and cafe. Last year I mentioned that in English as well as in Spanish, we use many words that come from African languages. I have some examples here. For example, zebra, chimpanzee, safari. Safari means traveling, okay, in Swahili. Cheetah, which is the leopard. Well, it's one of the big cats. Banana, something that we use every day. Jumbo, cola, as in Coca-Cola. Okay, cola comes from African languages. Voodoo, the religion practiced in Haiti. Ubuntu, which has in recent years gained popularity because Ubuntu is a philosophy that means humanity. It's one way of seeing. It's a very interesting philosophy applied, for example, in or taught in South Africa. Nelson Mandela used this concept of Ubuntu, meaning like I cannot live if you don't live. I cannot exist if you're not there. So really, the only reason for me is because for me being me and being alive is because you are there. That's more or less the idea of Ubuntu. Other word from African origins is tote. Now we see our students here with what we call tote bags. These big bags made of fabric that we use, for example, for going to the supermarket. Those are called tote bags. That's also a word from an African language. Now, if we look here in the map, we see that India was also super important and influential in the English we use today. Every day we talk about curry, right? For example, we can have chicken curry. Bungaloo, that comes from India. The word looks like some kind of hut, a little house. Mango, yes, from India. Pajamas, I mentioned this last week. Pajamas meaning big pants, loose pants. Jungle, Indian word. Kashmir, from the region, and these nice sweaters, right? Kashmir. Shampoo, something that we use every day or almost every day. Shampoo means massage, okay, in India. Karma, every day we talk about karma. We expect sometimes karma, good karma and bad karma to happen to people. Avatar, every day when we talk about not only the movie Avatar, no, but for internet language, right? Avatars meaning the images, the digital images of people, right? Avatar, that comes from India. And nirvana, something that many want to reach. Now, we mentioned sushi, but also from Japanese, English has borrowed many words. For example, tempura, which is a delicious way of cooking chicken, sushi, right? Ramen, very popular soup. Now, teriyaki, you can go wherever you go. You can go to Éxito Supermarket, De Uno, Jumbo, and you can buy teriyaki. Tofu, all these words are now part of English. Sake, which is a liquor from made of rice, like some rice wine. All the names for the martial arts: karate, taekwondo. Well, taekwondo is Korean. Karate, judo, aikido. Right. That's another fascinating story. The meaning of these words in Japanese, but that's for another podcast. Tsunami. Yeah. Karaoke. Do you know the meaning of karaoke, Leonardo? Do you like karaoke? Okay, so kara, empty. karaoke orchestra. So karaoke is an empty orchestra. That's why you have to use a microphone to fill in. Okay, karaoke, something that you use every day, hundreds of times. Emoji. Okay, emoji on WhatsApp comes from Japanese. Uh, Very popular things like manga and anime, right? Our students really like these kind of books and stories. All these words come from Japan. Kimono, samurai, zen, and origami. We have origami workshops, right? Okay, so imagine this language, right? Absorbing all these words from different cultures, right? That's why English is so rich and diverse. At the same time, English can be challenging for learners because you have to somehow place yourself in many different cultures at the same time. There are many things about English that make it difficult to understand for students. For example, why does English have so many irregular verbs? Why are there so many exceptions to the rules? Why in English? Why do we have to use auxiliaries? Do, does, all these things. The answer to these questions are very complex because the the answer is really in the history and the evolution over time and the borrowing from all these different languages. So it's very difficult to understand it, and sometimes it doesn't even matter because no one knows the answer, or someone who's really an expert who has been years and years studying the origins. But sometimes you ask your teacher, why do you say this, or why do you have to use this or that, and the teacher doesn't know because no one really knows, right? And that's part of this evolution of the language. So what do you think, Leonardo? Huh? Are you surprised? Very much. Okay, yes, very interesting to see all these origins, right? So when these all these origins have given English different patterns, what we call patterns. Patterns in Spanish is what we call patrones. So one of the something that we really need to in order to learn English is to try to see and understand these patterns. In a book called The Cambridge Encyclopedia of the English Language, it's a book written by a man called David Crystal. He mentions that you need basically three elements to learn English. But I would say that you need the same three elements to learn any language. One is a normal intelligence. Okay, um, sometimes people think that you need to be super intelligent to learn English or any other language. I says no, you need normal intelligence. Now there is something that is true as well. If your intelligence is not completely normal, it may be very difficult for you to learn a second language. Sometimes people have learning disabilities, problems, right? And they may not be able to learn, or they may need very special teachers, right? Very or a very different methodologies. Okay, so he says if you have normal intelligence, okay, you have 30%. What else do you need? You need a normal memory. Yes, not a super memory. If you had super memory, you would be in a TV show or something like that, right? Demonstrating your memory. So what do you need? You need a normal memory. Why is memory important? Because obviously vocabulary needs to be remembered. What is the biggest problem that we have today? Today, we don't use our memory as much as we did in the past because everything we the only thing we need is a cell phone, right? So what do we have here? We have all the phone numbers, we have all the addresses, we don't even need to remember the streets. We just open apps like Waze, uh, and they take us to throughout the city, etc. So memory is something that we are not using as we did in the past, and memory is super important for learning any language, and English, which is our topic. So what do we have? Normal memory, normal intelligence. But the number three element is something very important. Is you need to develop and work on your ability to understand the patterns. Patrones, don't forget that. The patterns, how the things are organized in the language, because every language has a particular pattern. And when you listen to a person speak in the languages, you hear a special music. So when you hear someone, you may not understand anything because you're not really paying attention. But when you hear someone in the distance speaking English, you know that it's English or Spanish or Portuguese or German, French. Yes, you can identify those languages. Why? Because they have certain musicality, right? That what is called the music of the language, and this music of the language corresponds obviously to the pronunciation, but also the patterns of the language. So understanding these patterns, how the words are organized, how the questions are formed, is the secret to really learn a second language, any language, and especially English. So don't forget those three things. Normal memory, check, no problem. Normal intelligence, check, no problem. But develop your ability to see and understand the patterns. Okay. Okay, very good. So, what are we going to do? What are we going to talk about next week? Because we are about to finish this episode. Okay. So we have traveled today. We have traveled through centuries, from the Anglo-Saxons to Shakespeare, to see more or less why English is today the way it is. Okay. In our second episode, we're going to continue with this idea, and we're going to speak specifically about the British Empire, okay? A global influence on language. We will be exploring the expansion of the British Empire and how English spread globally. How in that time about 25% of the population was under the British rule. That means at least one out of four inhabitants of the planet was part of the British Empire. So we will be discussing some interesting facts. For example, countries where English is an official language due to colonization. Last week I mentioned that English is not the official language in the United States. We're going to talk about that. But I heard in the news that now Mr. Trump wants to make English the official language, yeah? And it's only natural. If you think about it, in Colombia, for example, in the constitution of the country, uh, I guess, I'm not sure, but I guess it says that Spanish is
Spanish is
our
official
official
languages.
language. Why is that important? Because everything that is regarded to legal matters need to follow a legal language, right? Or an official language. In the United States, the situation has been different. They decided not to use or not to include English as the official language. We're going to talk about that next week. So to our listeners and our viewers, please send us a message. Let us know what you think of the topics we're discussing. Send us questions. I will answer to the best of my ability, or we can always Google an answer. Please send us messages, comments, suggestions for improvement, and don't forget to be here next week for our second episode of Tune In and Speak Up. Okay, Leonardo, is that a deal?
Muy bien, pues aquí llegamos a la sección final de este podcast maravilloso que nos presenta el profe Jorge Bermúdez desde el Departamento de Estudios Interculturales de nuestra Universidad Militar Nueva Granada y el Departamento, bueno, y la Facultad de Educación y Humanidades. Esta es la sección Spanglish, profe. Profe, le envían saludos. Melissa se conecta y dice, oiga, este profe tiene una pronunciación genial. Es muy comprensible, de veras, aquí nos chatea y está muy contenta. Y entonces, bueno, miren, para las personas que nos ven hoy, este es el podcast que nos trae el profe Jorge Bermúdez. Lo he dicho, es mi concepto muy subjetivo, muy mío. A que no se me malinterprete, pero el profe Jorge Bermúdez es el mejor profe de inglés, de veras. Y esta es una manera muy interesante de reforzar ese conocimiento del inglés, de practicar el listening. Ya decía el profe, la tercera condición, el tercer requisito para aprender una segunda lengua es desarrollar esa habilidad de escuchar, ver.
Entender el patrón del lenguaje.
Usted hablaba de la memoria, ¿no? Uno es...
una inteligencia normal.
Una inteligencia normal.
Una memoria que hay que ejercitar.
He escuchado en muchas ocasiones personas que dicen, no, para aprender idiomas, por ejemplo, aquella persona que estudia idiomas y al mismo tiempo alemán, francés, español, se requiere un IQ más alto. Entonces uno dice, no, ahí ya no clasifico. Pero usted nos da ánimo, profe, usted a los que consideramos que tenemos una inteligencia normal o tal vez inferior a lo normal, decía Estefano en el león marino Estefano en Madagascar, una inteligencia ligeramente inferior, pero se puede. Y entonces este es un espacio muy interesante, profe, para practicar todas estas habilidades, además desde la cultura general que usted nos trae.
Fíjese que hay cosas increíbles. Por ejemplo, entender las diferencias en los idiomas. Entonces, el estudiante llega a la clase, el profesor le dice, bueno, para hacer una pregunta tú tienes que usar do, ¿cierto?
Yeah.
O did, entonces, pero nunca le dice al estudiante por qué. Y el estudiante de pronto nunca tiene la curiosidad. Entonces yo les pongo a mis estudiantes, les pongo un ejemplo. Yo les digo, para ilustrar una diferencia importante, ¿no? Yo digo, pónganse en esta situación. Usted tiene un quiz. Entonces llega al salón y ve a su amigo, a su amiga. ¿Usted qué le pregunta? Uno que le dice al amigo, dice, ¿estudiaste? ¿Cierto? Entonces, fíjese la belleza que tiene el español, ¿cierto? Porque esa palabra incluye todo. Entonces, usted se encuentra a su amigo y le dice, ¿estudiaste? Ahí hay tres cosas, ¿cierto? Una, hay una indicación de que es en el pasado, ¿cierto? Otra, te estoy hablando a ti, ¿cierto? Y otra que es la acción. Entonces está el qué, el cuándo y el quién, ¿cierto? El qué, estudiar, el cuándo, en el pasado estudiaste, y el quién, tú, ¿cierto? ¿Estudiaste? Bueno, entonces fíjese que si uno, ¿cómo se hace esa pregunta en inglés? Entonces, en inglés, el profesor le dice, es que usted tiene que usar el auxiliar. Ah, cierto, entonces es, did you study? 3 palabras. ¿Cómo es posible que tengamos que usar 3 palabras y en español solo usamos una palabra? Ah, bueno, entonces la respuesta es muy sencilla. En español hay una palabra para todo, para todo. En inglés no. En inglés, el inglés es como un Lego. Hay que poner esta pieza y esta otra pieza, pero esta piecita nos va a servir en muchas otras partes. Entonces, como esta piecita aquí la usamos de una forma y aquí de otra, necesitamos otra cosa. Entonces, un auxiliar, bueno, otro tipo o un significado diferente. Esos son los patrones que hay que entender. Entonces, entender esos patrones es clave para entender el inglés. Después cuando uno le explican eso, le dicen, es que en esas 3 palabras, ahí está lo que usted necesita saber. El qué, study, el cuándo, did, y el quién, you. Bueno. Entonces, la próxima vez que vaya a hacer una pregunta, usted se tiene que poner a pensar, yo necesito coger unos elementos de aquí y de allá. And that's the story. That's the beauty of English, and that's the idea, the patterns that you have to recognize. Okay?
Sí, señor. Pues aquí está. Y como decía, nos contaba que el profe, pues volveremos, o volverá el profe Jorge Bermúdez para el próximo capítulo, el próximo martes. La influencia, por ejemplo, de los idiomas africanos, japoneses, que han tenido sobre el inglés. Entonces, el latín, supremamente interesante, profe. Así que muchísimas gracias. Y antes de despedirnos, vamos a escuchar aquí nuestra promo que nos envía nuestra amiga Clemi, nuestra inolvidable amiga Clemi. ¿Dónde está Clemi hoy? Ella que gira
Londres.
Ok, escuchemos aquí a Clemi.
Tune in and speak up. Hello, English learners. Want to learn something interesting whilst having fun? Welcome to Tune In and Speak Up, the podcast where you'll get to know this beautiful language in depth. Each week, we'll dive into exciting topics, share practical tips, and tell you fascinating English language stories. So whether you're studying, going to work, or just relaxing, connect, listen, and let's make English part of your world. Wherever you are, whenever you want, just hit play, tune in and listen up. Tune in to UIMINIHE Radio every Tuesday from 11 a.m. till noon. Don't just learn English, live it.
Microphone. Okay, so don't forget to tune in and speak up next week. The podcast about curiosities, interesting things, and culture, okay, of the English language. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next week. All the best. Thank you. Bye, Leonardo.
Bye bye, teacher.
Desde la Universidad Militar Nueva Granada, en Bogotá, Colombia, transmite UMNG Radio. UMNG Radio. Una emisora alternativa, cultural e independiente. Desde la Universidad Militar Nueva Granada. Esta es UMNG Radio.